I don't think anyone noticed the first time I started to pull back. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. The thing is, they never really were. At first, I just started talking less, letting my words fall away and dissolve into the noise of the conversation. I'd nod, smile, and give all the right signals, but I wasn't really there. It was like watching my own life through a glass window, separated from everyone I was supposed to be close to. I remember the first time I left early from a group hangout. Nobody noticed. I made some excuse about being tired, needing to head home early, and they all nodded, barely looking up. I was halfway down the street before it really hit me. Not one of them had asked if I was okay or why. I seemed distant. It was such a small moment, but it felt enormous, like a shift in the Earth's axis. I started to test the waters after that, skipping out on plans or staying silent in group chats. I didn't say anything in our shared jokes or give my usual reactions. The surprising part was that everything just continued on without me, as if I'd never been part of it to begin with. It wasn't that I wanted them to beg me to come back or to make some grand gesture. I just wanted them to notice. I wanted someone to pull me aside and say, "Hey, you haven't been yourself lately. What's going on?" But the reality was stark and silent. I was becoming invisible, a shadow on the wall fading into the paint, and nobody cared enough to notice the empty space where I once stood. It felt like my presence had been taken for granted for so long that the thought of losing me didn't even occur to them. In those moments of withdrawal, I started reflecting on how much I had given over the years. I was the one who made sure everyone got home safe after a night out. I was the one who stayed up late, talking someone through their heartbreak, listening to the same worries over and over again because they needed a shoulder to cry on. And I never complained. I gave because I wanted it, because I thought that's what love and friendship were about. But sitting there in my empty room, scrolling through the notifications on my phone that never came, I realized how one-sided it all felt. When you're the one holding the strings together, no one ever thinks to ask how you're doing. You become part of the background, a fixture in their lives that's just expected to be there. It wasn't until I started pulling away that I realized how little they actually saw me. They saw what I did for them, the role I played, but not me. Not the person who needed love, who needed someone to reach out first for a change. And that's when I knew it wasn't just a phase. This was the beginning of the end. The slow unraveling of something I once thought was unbreakable. Leaving isn't something you decide overnight, even when you feel pushed out. It's a process. A series of moments that stack up like bricks in a wall until you can't see any light on the other side. I thought about the times I had been the one to hold everyone together. I thought about the texts I sent in the middle of the night, the thoughtful gifts I'd picked out because I knew what would make them smile. I remembered every little effort I put in to show them that I cared, that I was thinking of them. And what did I get in return? Silence, indifference, a void where their concern should have been. It started to feel like I was carrying a boulder on my back, the weight of everyone's problems mixed with the crushing realization that when I needed them, they were nowhere to be found. I'd scroll through our chat history and see message after message of me checking in, making plans, starting conversations. The pattern was glaringly obvious once I saw it. If I didn't initiate, there was nothing. I felt like I was screaming underwater, my words bubbling up to the surface where nobody could hear them. The silence was unbearable. I don't think they realized how deep it cut, how every ignored message and unreturned call was like a knife, chipping away at whatever connection we had left. It wasn't that I wanted them to match my efforts exactly, but I needed something, anything, to show me that I mattered to them beyond what I could give. I needed to know I wasn't just a tool, a placeholder friend who filled in the gaps when it was convenient. But every day that passed without a single word proved what I'd feared most. They'd never really valued me. They liked what I did for them, how I made them feel, but they didn't care about me as a person. It was a hard truth to swallow, like a jagged pill lodged in my throat. I wanted to scream at them to make them see what they were losing, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They couldn't see the emptiness growing inside me, and by the time they did, it would be far too late. When I finally decided to leave, it wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no explosion of emotions. It was a quiet exit, the kind you make when you don't want to draw attention to yourself. I stopped responding to messages, left a few group chats, and faded into the background. I expected them to notice. I waited for the messages, the concerned calls, but they never came. Days turned into weeks, and I realized something devastating. My absence was barely a ripple in their lives. I had spent so long believing I was an integral part of their world. I was the one who brought the energy, who made the plans, who kept us all together. But here I was, gone. And nothing had changed. It felt like I'd been watching a play from backstage, thinking I was a main character, only to realize I was just an extra all along. The hardest part was the realization that they were fine without me. It wasn't that I wanted them to fall apart or be miserable without me. I just wanted them to notice the difference. I wanted them to look around and realize that something was missing, that the laughter wasn't as loud, that the conversations didn't flow as easily. I wanted them to see the void I left behind. But it seemed like they had filled it with ease, without a second thought. I sat with that feeling, the bitter taste of it heavy in my mouth. I had been the one who held on the longest, who fought for these connections even when it drained me. But now, for the first time, I felt a strange kind of peace. It was as if I had been carrying a heavy load for years, only to finally set it down. I was free, and as much as it hurt to admit, I was better off without them. They say time heals all wounds, but I don't think that's entirely true. Time just helps you see things more clearly. As the days passed, I stopped expecting messages. I stopped looking for signs that they missed me, because I knew they wouldn't come. And that's okay. I realized that I deserved more than what they were willing to give. I deserved friends who would notice if I disappeared, who would feel the loss of me, not just for what I did, but for who I was. I realized I didn't leave because I wanted them to chase me. I left because I needed to find myself again, to reclaim the pieces of me that I had lost trying to hold everyone else together. In the silence of their absence, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. I was no longer drowning in the noise of people who never truly saw me. I was finally free to be seen, first and foremost, by myself. I wasn't there to see it, but I could feel it happening from a distance, like a tremor shaking the foundations of a building I once lived in. At first, it was just a vague sense of unease, unease, a feeling that things weren't quite right. I heard snippets from mutual friends, casual mentions that something felt off lately, like the group didn't flow the way it used to. They wouldn't say it outright, but I knew what they were describing. They were starting to feel the absence of something they couldn't quite put their finger on. The quiet unraveling of the dynamic I had once held together with invisible strings. It's strange how you can tell when someone misses you, even when they don't say it out loud. The messages started trickling in, not in a flood like I might have once imagined, but like hesitant raindrops before a storm. Hey, it's been a while. We haven't seen you in ages. Are you okay? But the words were hollow, like they were checking a box rather than reaching out from a place of genuine concern. I could tell they felt awkward, like they were trying to figure out why things weren't quite the same anymore, without fully understanding that the missing piece was me. I thought about responding at first, the way I always used to, reassuring them that I was fine, just busy, making up excuses to ease their discomfort. But I didn't. I left the messages unread, watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear as they debated what to say next, if anything. It was almost painful to witness, this fumbling attempt at connection that came far too late. It was as if they were realizing, all at once, that they had taken me for granted, and now they didn't know how to get me back. What they didn't understand was that it wasn't just about showing up now that things felt different. It wasn't about sending a few messages or inviting me out for drinks like nothing had changed. It was about years of neglect, of letting me be the one who always reached out, who always held everyone together without asking for anything in return. It was about the moments when I had needed them most, and they were nowhere to be found. I wasn't angry anymore. I was past that. I had moved into a space beyond anger, into a kind of calm resignation. I knew they would feel the void, but I also knew they wouldn't know how to fill it. I imagined them meeting up without me, sitting around the table and trying to recreate the ease and comfort we once had. I could almost see the awkward silences stretching out, the forced laughs that didn't quite reach their eyes. They'd start reminiscing, bringing up old jokes that no longer landed the same way. Someone would crack a joke, and there would be that split second of hesitation, like they were all waiting for my laugh to validate it. And when it didn't come, the laughter would die off quickly, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet. They wouldn't talk about it directly, at least not at first. They'd probably skirt around it, make excuses for why things felt off. It's just a weird night, they'd say. We're all just busy lately. But deep down, they'd know. It would gnaw at them in those quiet moments, the realization creeping in slowly, like fog rolling in over a clear sky. They'd start to notice all the little things they used to take for granted. The way I always knew what to say to diffuse tension. The way I'd remember everyone's favorite drinks. The way I'd check in on the quiet ones to make sure they felt included. They'd start to see the tiny details they never paid attention to before. But by then it would be too late. I heard through the grapevine that small arguments started breaking out more often. The kind of disagreements that used to be smoothed over easily now lingered, leaving a bitter aftertaste that no one knew how to fix. Without me there to play the peacemaker, to find the common ground, things began to fall apart in ways they hadn't anticipated. Plans didn't come together as smoothly. Events that used to be filled with laughter and camaraderie now felt strained. like everyone was trying too hard to recapture something they couldn't quite name. It was like watching a once beautiful painting fade and crack, the colors dulling and flaking away without the protective varnish I used to provide. They started reaching out more frequently then, as if they could sense that something vital had slipped through their fingers. The texts became longer, filled with nostalgia and attempts at humor, trying to pull me back in with memories of the good times. They'd say things like, "Remember that night we stayed up until dawn, just talking about everything and nothing," or "I was thinking about that road, a trip we took last summer. It's not the same without you." I read them all, felt the tug of sentimentality pulling at me, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. It wasn't because I didn't care anymore. It was because I cared too much, and I knew that going back would only mean falling into the same old patterns. The same unbalanced dynamic where I gave everything and received nothing but silence in return. It's not that I wanted them to fall apart without me. I didn't wish them ill. In fact, I wanted them to be happy, to find the connection they were searching for. But I knew they wouldn't find it by ignoring the void I'd left behind. They had to face it, to acknowledge that I had been more than just a background player in their story. I had been a central piece, and without me, the picture didn't quite make sense anymore. It's a strange kind of validation knowing they miss me now. It's bittersweet, because I spent so long waiting for this moment, hoping that they'd realize what they had before it was gone. But now that it's here, it feels different than I imagined. It's like watching a movie of my own life from a distance, seeing the plot unfold without feeling the same emotional pull. I've moved on, started finding my own peace, filling my own cup for the first time in years. And in that space of healing, I've realized that I don't need their validation anymore. I don't need them to tell me I was important. I know I was. I always knew. It just took leaving for me to finally believe it. In the end, they're left with the emptiness, the unraveling of something they once took for granted. And maybe one day they'll fully understand. Maybe they'll sit around the table years from now and talk about the friend who used to make everything better without them ever realizing it. They'll say, "I wonder what happened to them. I wonder why we let them slip away." And in that moment, they'll feel the void, the space I once filled. And they'll understand that it was never about what I did for them. It was about who I was, and they didn't see it until it was too late. And as for me, I've learned that my worth isn't tied to what I give others, but to who I am when I'm not bending over backward to fit into someone else's life. I've started finding people who see me, who don't need me to prove my value because they already know it. I've found a peace I never thought possible, a quiet contentment in knowing that I'm finally choosing myself. They may never fill the void I left behind, but that's not my problem to solve anymore. It's theirs, and I hope they figure it out, because I've already moved on to a place where I no longer have to worry about empty spaces. There's a kind of peace that settles in when you finally decide to leave. It's not the loud, triumphant feeling you might expect after making a difficult choice. It's quiet, like the stillness that follows a storm. At first, it feels almost unnatural, like the silence is pressing in around you, a vacuum left by the absence of all the noise you were used to. I thought I would feel more sadness, or maybe even regret, but instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. I remember waking up one morning, weeks after I'd stopped trying to reach out, and for the first time, I didn't check my phone. There was no urge to scroll through the messages that weren't there, no pang of disappointment at seeing that they hadn't reached out. The realization was startling and liberating at the same time. It was as if a switch had been flipped in my mind, a quiet voice telling me that I didn't need to keep looking for validation from people who had shown me over and over again that I was a convenience, not a necessity. The world seemed different, sharper somehow. I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in a long time. The sun felt warmer on my skin. The sounds of birds outside my window seemed brighter, more cheerful. It was like a fog had lifted, one I didn't even realize had been clouding my vision. I had been so wrapped up in trying to hold on to relationships that were already slipping through my fingers that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be in my own company, without the weight of unmet expectations hanging over me. In the beginning, there was a fear that leaving would mean losing a part of myself. I'd spent so much time defining who I was based on the roles I played for others. The fixer, the peacemaker, the one who always had the right words to say. Letting go of those roles felt like shedding a layer of skin, leaving me raw and exposed. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I realized I wasn't losing myself. I was finding parts of me I hadn't seen in years, parts that had been buried under the weight of other people's needs. I started doing things just for me. Small things at first, like taking myself out for coffee, sitting by the window with a book and feeling the warm sunlight on my face. I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in so long. There was no one to check in with, no one expecting me to fill the silence or smooth over the rough edges. It was just me, and it felt like I was learning how to breathe again. The messages still came, sporadic and unsure. I could tell they were struggling to understand why I had stepped back. The tone of their texts shifted from casual to something more urgent, like they were trying to find the right words to pull me back in. "We miss you," they'd say. "It's not the same without you." It was strange reading those words and feeling nothing but a distant kind of pity. Once upon a time, I would have jumped at the chance to mend the rift, to reassure them that I wasn't really gone. But now I could see the pattern for what it was. A cycle I had been stuck in for far too long. They missed the version of me who always showed up, who never asked for anything in return. They missed the comfort I provided, the way I made everything feel easier, lighter. But they didn't miss me, not the real me, the one who had finally chosen to put herself first. There's a moment of clarity that comes when you realize you don't owe anyone your time, your energy, or your love, just because they've become accustomed to receiving it. I thought about all the times I had stretched myself thin, putting their needs before my own, believing that if I just gave a little more, they'd finally see my worth. But now I see how misguided that was. My worth isn't something that needs to be proven or earned through sacrifice. It exists inherently whether they recognize it or not. I imagine them sometimes, sitting together without me. I can picture the looks on their faces, the shared glances, the slight edge of discomfort that lingers when they realize things aren't the same. Maybe they talk about me, try to piece together why I left, what they could have done differently. Maybe they tell themselves that I'm the one who changed, that I became distant for reasons they'll never fully understand. And in a way, they're right. I did change. I became someone who stopped looking for validation in places where it was never going to be given. I became someone who learned that it's okay to walk away when the cost of staying is too high. I've come to terms with the fact that they might never fully understand what happened. They might never see the subtle ways I pulled back, the small signs I left like breadcrumbs, hoping someone would notice before it was too late. They might never realize that my departure wasn't a sudden decision, but the result of years of feeling unseen, unheard, unappreciated. And that's okay. I've stopped needing closure from them, stopped needing the apology or the acknowledgement that may never come. Instead, I've given myself my own closure. I've started writing again, filling pages with thoughts and dreams I'd forgotten I had. I've reconnected with old friends who bring lightness and laughter into my life without expecting anything in return. I've found new hobbies, new passions that make my soul feel alive. It's as if I've stepped out of a dark room into the bright open air, and I'm finally taking in a full, deep breath. I've realized that the void I left behind isn't mine to worry about anymore. They'll have to figure out how to fill it, or maybe they won't. Maybe they'll learn to live with the space I once occupied, the empty seat at the table that serves as a quiet reminder of what they lost. I don't feel guilty about it anymore. I've spent enough time feeling guilty, feeling like I wasn't enough, or that I needed to be more for people who never saw me for who I truly was. Now, when I look at myself in the mirror, I see someone I recognize again. There's a softness in my eyes, a calmness that wasn't there before. I see a person who knows her own worth, who doesn't need to fight to be seen or heard. I've found peace in the silence, in the space I've carved out for myself. It's a space filled with self-love, with acceptance, with the kind of quiet joy that comes from knowing you've made the right choice, even when it was hard. I've finally moved on, and it feels like stepping into a new world, one where I get to set the terms, where I get to decide who comes in and who doesn't. It's a world where I am the main character of my own story, not a supporting role in someone else's. And for the first time in a long time, I feel free. I feel whole. I feel like I've come home to myself.